Colorado and Deion Sanders are taking on Matt Rhule in Nebraska. This time, it's a little bit different.
You are Locked On Buffs, your daily podcast on the Colorado Buffaloes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a crossover episode of Locked On Buffs and Locked On Nebraska. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. We are also brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day for free and available wherever you get your podcast. And we have one of the most underrated rivalries in college football taking place this weekend. And joining me is Locked On Nebraska's Mitch Sherman, also of The Athletic. Mitch, thank you for joining us. This is going to be a blast.
Yeah, Kevin, great to be here. Absolutely, it's underrated when the teams are unranked, right? But I remember a day when this was one of the most highly rated rivalries in college football.
Right, yeah. We're going to talk about that a little bit because I think a lot of times in college football, we think of rivalries and we think of rivalry week, and it's like we have Texas and Oklahoma, or we have whoever else it may be, Alabama and whoever they're, you know what I mean. And so Colorado, Nebraska just often gets overlooked. And this year in particular, there's going to be a lot of eyes on this game. Last year, there was almost 9 million on this game. And this year, I think it's going to be a better game all around. And so let's talk about, from Nebraska's perspective, what's the biggest difference, right? We saw them last year. They had a decent first year. They were probably hoping for a little bit better, but they had some weaknesses. So let's talk about how this team's new for the Nebraska perspective.
Sure. Nebraska had a good middle stretch of the season last year. After the Michigan game for about a month, it was slow to start, as we saw with road games against Minnesota and Colorado. Those were 2 losses. Tough to start 0-2 and come home for your coaching debut at a school, as Matt Rhule did, without a win in 2 games. They dug out of that hole, and then November was difficult. Nebraska lost 4 close games at the end that kept the Huskers out of a bowl in Matt Rhule's first season. Things have changed a lot. You know, the most notable change for this team is at quarterback. Colorado fans saw Jeff Sims a year ago, the Georgia Tech transfer, and that was really the end for Jeff Sims. After that game, he was hurt in the second half of the Colorado game, injured, went down. Heinrich Haarberg came in, and Sims really didn't return in any kind of a full-time capacity after that Colorado game in week 2. We saw him in some very brief stints, and he just continued to be have big problems with turnovers, as was the case in that game in Boulder. 4 turnovers for Nebraska, created just 1 turnover, and had Nebraska fighting from behind and kind of running uphill for the entirety of those 60 minutes in Boulder. So, yeah, I would expect that this one with Dylan Raiola, the true freshman, who, of course, is much more of a prototypical NFL pro-style passer, even with just 1 game of college experience under his belt, than what Nebraska had in Sims last year. I would expect that this one is going to be much more on the competitive side as we get into the second half.
Yeah, I think a quarterback, you don't realize how bad your team is when you have a quarterback that can't really move you down the field. A lot of times quarterbacks are usually the ones that are masking the weaknesses, which we saw for Colorado last year. Shedeur Sanders was sacked 7 times in this game, and they were still able to pull out a victory. And we saw that a few times throughout the season where he'd be sacked an excessive amount of times, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, but Colorado's within a score here. And so for Colorado, the new team, quote unquote, is they bring in around 45-ish guys in the portal. They have a brand new offensive line, which we saw against North Dakota State. They held up quite well, only gave 1 sack, which honestly was Shedeur's fault. He ran right into it. So this line is a lot better. But this defense is where I sort of circle my concern for Colorado, mostly because of the new guy you mentioned, Dylan Raiola. So talk about him and his new weapon, because those are kind of the 2 things that they didn't have last year. You didn't have a 1,000-yard passer, and I don't think you had a receiver eclipse 400 yards, if I'm not mistaken. So talk about Isaiah Neyor and Dylan Raiola and how they change this offense for you.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, Raiola's he's made out of the NFL model. You know, he's the son of a 14-year NFL vet, Dominic Raiola, who was a center for the Detroit Lions and played with Matthew Stafford. And Dan Orlovsky, Drew Stanton, all of the quarterbacks in Dylan Raiola's life and Dominic Raiola's life were mentors to Dominic's two sons, and he brought up his sons to play the quarterback position. Strange as that seems, when you played center for 14 years in the NFL,
Right.
and Dominic was a center at Nebraska, was a Remington Award winner in 2000. He reminded Dylan this week, headed into the Colorado game, that he never lost to Colorado in 4 years as a Cornhusker, including his redshirt year in 1997. So Dylan, of course, is an important new weapon for Nebraska, but you can't get it done as a quarterback without receivers. Isaiah Nair was the star in the first game. He's the transfer from Texas, also a transfer from Wyoming. He went from Wyoming, where he had a big year in 2021, to Texas, spent 2 years there, mostly injured and on the bench. And then he finds his way to Nebraska here in the senior season, had a big opener with more than 100 yards receiving, the 59-yard touchdown pass in the first half. He's not the only one, though. Jamal Banks is actually more of an accomplished receiver statistically than Nair, as a guy who put up big numbers at Wake Forest over the last few years. So between Banks and Nair, Nebraska has weapons that just didn't exist in this offense a year ago.
Yeah, I talked about Naylor on my show a couple days ago, and I described him in Texas terms as he was supposed to be what Adonai Mitchell was this past year. He just obviously tore his ACL in his first spring game, and then was never really able to find a role in the offense. And so I have a quick question about Raiola before we move on to the second aspect of this new team discussion. Is he
Yep.
Mahomesy? Is he Mahomesy? I think that's kind of the big thing around him, is he's kind of like, we've seen quarterbacks model after certain players, right? But I think he's about as close to Mahomes in terms of, I guess, style, look, play that we've seen, right?
There's been a lot made about the look. He does have a
Sure.
he does. Dylan has gone out of his way to model things after Patrick Mahomes. You see the haircut, you see the sunglasses. It's not entirely just coincidental.
Mhm.
As someone with the resources that Dylan has had at his disposal because of his dad's NFL background, and also because of the NIL resources that he's got here as a freshman at Nebraska.
Right.
You see Dylan doing things that freshmen of the past would not be able to do to model their game after an NFL superstar. Dylan Raiola has worked out with Jeff Christensen, who is Patrick Mahomes. Look at me, I'm confusing their names here in this right here as I talk
Same
about him.
person.
Christensen is the quarterback coach for both of these guys. Of course, has a long history with Patrick Mahomes out of Texas and Illinois. That's where Christensen comes from. Would expect to see him at the game. Who knows? We might see Patrick Mahomes at the game in Lincoln on Saturday. The Chiefs played on Thursday night, so he's open this weekend. You never know who might show up. And then Bobby Strope is Mahomes' trainer, that people will remember from the Netflix documentary Quarterback a year ago. He's the guy who does all of the kind of the off the field, like yoga type work with Mahomes, and has made Mahomes into the quarterback who seems to be like made of rubber at times.
Right.
Dylan is also working with Bobby Strope. So
Okay.
yeah, he's Mahomesian in that way. Is he Mahomesy in the way that he plays on the field? He has one game under his
Right.
belt as a college quarterback. He looked a little like Patrick out there in that game, but it was UTEP. So we're going to hold judgment entirely on that one.
Yeah, it's a tough comparison. Everyone that asks me about Dylan Raiola, it's like I've only seen him against UTEP, and this is no slam on the Miners, but they're probably team 130 out of 134 this year. They're in the middle
Something
of
like that.
a tough rebuild, so it's one of those things where it's hard to really tell what he is. Let's go over to the defensive side real quick. I'll start with Colorado.
Mhm.
They, outside of Travis Hunter, Shiloh Sanders, Shane Cokes, who's on the defensive line, he's a Dartmouth transfer from last year. It's pretty much brand new. They had Trevor Woods at linebacker, but he struggled against North Dakota State, and I don't know how long he'll hold on to that starting role. So Colorado's busting out a new defense. They have a first time ever defensive coordinator, Robert Livingston, spent some time with the Bengals. What's Nebraska's defense like? Is it same guys, same core, new looks? What did you see from them in that first week?
Right. It's the same thing as last year. You're
Okay.
going to lean heavy. Nebraska's going to lean heavy on the D line. Nash Hutmaker, Ty Robinson, Jamari Butler, all back as returning starters up front for a defense that ranked in the top 15 statistically last year. Now, this came against the Big Ten West, and Nebraska didn't face a lineup of quarterbacks like Colorado saw in the Pac-12. Didn't face a lineup of quarterbacks like, say, Michigan saw in playing in the Big Ten East. So, still, you have to give Nebraska credit, and coordinator Tony White, who was in his first year with Matt Rhule, coming over from Syracuse after the 2022 season. A lot of credit for what he built in one season. It was a transformed defense for Nebraska, and one of the best statistically in the country. Most of the pieces are back at all three levels. The secondary is probably the most, with the D-line. The secondary is as experienced as any group on this roster. And, I'm intrigued by the matchup of Jimmy Horn Jr. and Travis Hunter going against the Nebraska corners and even the Nebraska safeties when the matchups occur that we're going to see in this game. I think that's an area where Nebraska has a huge upgrade over what the Buffs saw against North Dakota State. They just don't have the athletes in the secondary that Nebraska has. Now, Nebraska has good athletes in the secondary, but they're not Travis Hunter kind of athletes. I mean, nobody in college football is. So I'm interested to see how these corners for Nebraska, who are like top half of the Big Ten corners, how they match up against a guy like Hunter and a guy like Horn.
Yeah, Colorado's got some burners out there. I think Colorado has the rare receiver core where 3 out of the 4 guys that are starting for them, because they start with 4 receivers, were number 1 receivers where they played last year. Travis Hunter / Jimmy Horn, they were kind of both the number 1 guy for Colorado. Will Shepherd comes over from Vanderbilt. He was the number 1 guy there. And then LeJonte Wester was one of the leading pass catchers in all of college football. So it's going to be a great matchup. We're going to talk about our concerns for both teams when we come back. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of Locked On Buffs and Locked On Nebraska is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. I'll paint you a picture. I graduated grad school looking for a job. Next thing you know, I see a job at the Pac-12 networks. I apply, talk to the hiring manager, learn what they need from me, what I need from them. And next thing you know, I start my career at the Pac-12 networks. And so LinkedIn Jobs isn't just a job board. It helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else. Professionals like me, possibly. Even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. They hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. So you could post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
And I want to take a minute to tell you about Home Field and introduce the Can't Miss Kickoff campaign, Nebraska fans, which is all about gearing up for this football season. First, Home Field is a premium collegiate apparel brand based in Indianapolis. They're focused on creating incredibly comfortable, officially licensed vintage college football designs affiliated with more than 100 universities and colleges. The Can't Miss Kickoff campaign is the thing to pay attention to right now. It delivers everything that a fan needs for the upcoming, already going college football season. You can get football boxes that include coaches' jackets, bomber jackets. The football box is definitely something that you want. It contains 3 never before, and this is specifically for Nebraska fans. So please use the code GBR24 to get this football box. It contains the Platinum VIP. It contains 3 never before seen items that gear you up for the season. The Platinum VIP box will get you a new hat, a new ringer, a VIP koozie, a 2024 Platinum Pass that guarantees you 20% off and early access so you get in before these boxes sell out. I've tried Home Field. Go ahead and give it a shot. It's great. If you want to get in, check out the website, homefieldapparel.com. Remember the code GBR24, which gets you 15% off at checkout. Thanks for supporting us at the Locked On Nebraska pod by supporting Home Field. Check out all the Nebraska apparel and special items at homefieldapparel.com.
Yeah, we're also brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day for free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So our everydayers out there, the guys that are commenting, yelling at us in the comments, liking, subscribing, we appreciate you no matter what you say. We're going to dive right back into our Locked On crossover with Locked On Buffs, Locked On Nebraska here. Let's talk concerns. I'll start with mine, and then you could kind of combat with yours. My
Sure.
concerns for Colorado, they bring in, I want to say 4 or 5 guys that I thought would be immediate impacts at pass rushers. They brought in BJ Green, who is an all second Pac-12 team guy at edge rusher. They brought in Deion Hayes, who is a multi-year starter at Pitt. They brought in Samuel Kunalola, also a guy from Pitt. Shout out to Pat Narduzzi. As Coach Prine said, they both played a lot. All 3 of these guys racked up a ton of sacks. Last week against North Dakota State, minimal pressure, they didn't bring Cam Sims down at all. And so Dylan Raiola,
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about this on my show. He's in the comparing him to Mahomes, for lack of a better comparison. You can't just get him out of the pocket because he thrives where he's running and he will throw it from every arm angle imaginable. So my concern for Colorado is getting pressure on Dylan Raiola isn't enough. They have to get to him. And so how would you say that Nebraska is sort of combating that? Because I saw on PFF the 2 tackles were the ones that struggled the most, according to the grading. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Nebraska's offensive tackles were a concern coming into the season, in part because Teddy Prohaska, who was slated to be, or certainly slated to be, one of the favorites as the starting left tackle, went down with a knee injury early in camp. So Nebraska's had to turn to Turner Corcoran, who's been a starter for most of his career, but was frankly positioned to be somebody who could move around the offensive line this year, provide depth. If a player went down, Corcoran was somebody that Nebraska could have stuck in really at any position as a veteran guy. And now he's the Huskers' starting left tackle. Bryce Benhart, Nebraska's starting right tackle, he started his 42nd game, an all-time record for a Nebraska offensive lineman to open the season against UTEP. I wouldn't say he necessarily played his best game out there in run block. The tackles, the entire line was pretty strong. Pass block, I thought there were times where even the UTEP defensive ends, some of the players coming off the edge were able to get a little bit of pressure on Raiola. He handled it well. But I will say this, Kevin, Raiola, the comparisons to Mahomes are interesting. They're a little bit fun to have. We've in no way seen that he's got Patrick Mahomes' escapability. Is he a mobile guy? Oh, perhaps. I mean, he can be athletic. He does throw from those different arm angles. I think he's got some elusiveness to him. It is not going to be his game to get out and scramble and move the chains the way that Mahomes has done throughout his college and pro career. So I would have concerns, from Nebraska's point of view, if the Buffs are able to pressure Raiola and get him on the run, get him out of the pocket. The other place where you have concerns is just in Nebraska's ability to put teams away, in Nebraska's ability to have kind of the hammer. It has plagued this program for years. You look at Nebraska, in this recent double home and home that the Huskers and the Buffs are getting through, playing the 4th game in right here and now. The first game of Scott Frost's regime at Nebraska, way back in 2018, was Colorado coming into Lincoln. Nebraska seemed to have the game in hand. True freshman quarterback at the helm. Adrian Martinez goes down with an injury toward the end. Colorado comes back and wins that thing. You see Nebraska go to Boulder a year later in 19, blow a 17-0 halftime lead, lose that game in overtime. Those storylines are not unique to the Colorado-Nebraska series in recent years. Nebraska has done that over and over in Big Ten play. So until Nebraska gets to a place with the progression of its program under Rhule where it can win games that are close, that's always going to be a concern with this group and this program.
Yeah, and I think specifically against Colorado, you look at what Shedeur Sanders has done. Granted, they only won 4 games last year, right? So I'm not saying he's this profound come from behind artist, but of their 4 wins last year, I would say TCU was a close game, and he had a big drive down the field. Nebraska, obviously, they were able to extend the lead quickly, but Colorado State, he drove down the field and set them up in overtime to win the game. And then same thing against Arizona State. He drove down the field to set up a game-winning field goal. So Shedeur Sanders is one of those guys where if the ball is in his hands with, say, 3 minutes left or whatever, and you're not winning, when you are winning, he will throw the ball on first down when he doesn't need to, apparently, as we saw against North Dakota State. But he is someone that's capable of driving down the field and sort of finishing off a team that wasn't able to fend them off long enough. So I do feel like that's a valid sort of concern specifically for Colorado, because If Shedeur Sanders has the ball, I think there's a lot of confidence that he could drive down the field and win the game. I'll go with my next concern. And you kind of mentioned how good Nebraska was at the beginning of this show. The defensive front, right? They're good at getting to the quarterback and they're good at disrupting the run. Colorado, they protected Shedeur well week 1, right? But the run game was atrocious. Practically, Colorado, I think they veered away from it after the second quarter. They kind of they did this last year as well, where they would try a few run plays here and there, and they just couldn't get any yards. And I think I saw the stat, I believe it was 1.4 yards before contact in week 1, which isn't great for the Colorado running backs. And I haven't seen it in the Deion Sanders era where they figure out a way to get the run game involved. And so that's a concern of mine because it's a lot of pressure each and every week to be like, Shedeur, Travis, Jimmy, go make us plays. So talk to me about that defensive front, how they can make life hard for Colorado.
Yeah, typically I'd say that's a big advantage, Nebraska. The fact that it can play a team that shouldn't be all that difficult to turn one-dimensional. I don't know that it's as significant in this game. Is Colorado even going to come out and try to establish the run game, or are they just going to say, all right, our strength is throwing the ball. We've got great receivers. There's a quarterback who is going to throw for a lot of yards, even if he is behind the sticks because he took a sack on first down or second down. We'll still go get the first down. To me, that's kind of what Colorado represents offensively. And if they can establish the run game, that's a bonus. And I don't think that watching the North Dakota State game, watching Colorado as much as I did last year, I'd be surprised if the Buffs can establish something on the ground. I don't know really, Kevin, if they need to. That's how talented Shedeur Sanders is. Now, you ask about the Nebraska defensive line. They should be able to find a way to neutralize the Colorado run game, but can they take it to the next step? Sacking Sanders 7 times last year wasn't enough. Can you get to him more? I don't know that you got to sack him 12 times and say like that's the key to the game. To me, it's just eliminating big plays. It's eliminating the third down opportunities that Colorado has. They can't convert 3rd and 12s. You can't see Colorado having the over-the-top plays where they get behind the secondary on 3rd down when Nebraska's got to keep those receivers in front of them. And then, of course, for Nebraska, it's getting rid of the turnovers. The 4 turnovers last year in this game were backbreakers, and Nebraska did a fairly nice job in week 1 of minimizing those. It's been a huge focus throughout the entire offseason. They had 1 turnover, put it on the ground inside the 5-yard line of UTEP, but that did lead to a safety and somewhat of a turning point in the game. So they worked it in their favor, but it's not going to come like that against Colorado. If they turn it over, they're probably going to pay the price.
Yeah, Colorado's defense is very boomer bust. So like they get these big plays, whether it's an interception, fumble, and Colorado's offense is one of those teams where if you give Shedeur Sanders an extra possession and they're already up 7, we'll just say for this instance, now you just gave Shedeur Sanders a chance to go up 14 or help this offense go up 14. Mitch, do you have any concerns for Nebraska? Another concern about this Colorado team?
Well, I just talked about the explosiveness. I would say, look, I think that the crowd for Nebraska has the ability to be a huge factor in this game, but if Colorado, and Colorado can be an explosive team, if Colorado is able to put something together early in this game, like it's one thing if the Buffs have a 5-minute flash in the middle of the second quarter, when the game has settled in, you've developed a tempo and a rhythm. I think that's something that Nebraska could sustain as a lull at some point in the game. I think this has to start well for Nebraska. It's still a fragile program. Nebraska is. It's still a program that has not been able to win games on this big stage. It's still a program that's 29-52 since the end of the 2016 season, which is just kind of shocking to even recite those numbers, but it's the reality of it. So the crowd is going to come into this thing juiced to a level that we've not seen often. And, it's a stadium that sells out every week, but night game against an opponent like Colorado, with as much as Nebraska fans feel is at stake, they're going to come out ready to be a big factor in this game and disturb things that are happening for Colorado on offense. But if it comes out and hits a 60-yard pass on the 3rd play of the game, gets a turnover on Nebraska's first possession and turns it into points, that 86,000, it can turn real quiet really fast, and that becomes an advantage for Colorado. If that happens, I have concerns about Nebraska's ability to rebound from that
Yeah, I'll go on the contrary for that one because Colorado, I would say the most hostile environment they played in last year was Oregon, but that
Mhm.
game was out of hand by midway through the first quarter. So the crowd, I don't really think had an effect because it was just nothing was going for them. But if Colorado, say the opposite happens, say Dylan Rhule hits on a big pass and then Nebraska's defense gets a stop. Colorado has never been in an environment like this where it's going to be so hostile and they're trying to
Mhm.
come back like this. Like that would be a true test of this program's mental resilience and their mental toughness, which I think was a major flaw for them last year. I talked about it all off season. One of my biggest concerns heading into this year was they bring in all these new guys, right? Which is great. You upgrade on paper, but as soon as it gets hard, how can you react, right? As soon as Nebraska goes up 14-0, 10-0, how are you able to sort of be like, it's okay. We have 35 minutes left of football to play or whatever the time is. Like I think that's a major concern for me for Colorado. And then lastly, my other concern before we move on, Dylan Raiola, he thrived over the middle against UTEP. That was kind of what his chart showed. Cam
Mhm.
Sims was a perfect 4 for 4. He was a perfect 14 of 14 against Colorado last week. And so Colorado's secondary,
Hmm.
they played a lot of man coverage. And I don't know if that was sort of a film trick that they're hoping to pull off and they're going to switch up this week, or if that's just who they are because they played, according to PFF, it was 70% of man coverage, which last year the most a team did was played man coverage was like 50. So is that who Colorado is? I don't know, but is it going to work against Dylan Raiola in this offense? Also, don't know. What would you say about what you saw from Dylan and his ability to analyze the defense, albeit UTEP?
Yeah, he had a great double check or triple check, whatever you want to call it, into a run play. There was an initial check, a defensive check, and then another check on his part to go back into a run play that turned into a 42-yard gain that the
Mm,
Nebraska coaches raved about after the game as being so advanced for a true freshman in his
right.
first game to be able to diagnose and execute. He went through progressions better than Nebraska quarterbacks did at any point last season. So that was all very good. You have to take into account the competition. And, I think to a certain degree, you have to take into account the competition this week. Nebraska's going to see better defenses when it gets into the Big Ten. And even if he's able to handle things against the Buffs as far as diagnosing what kind of coverages they're in and finding holes, finding receivers who are beating man coverage, that's no guarantee that he's going to be able to do it against Ohio State, USC, Wisconsin, toward the end of the season. So that's a conversation for far down the road. I will say this to finish that thought: if the middle of the field is open, Nebraska's tight ends tight ends and slot receivers are dangerous,
Mm.
and we're somewhat underutilized in the opener. So I would look for Thomas Fidone. I would look for Carter Nelson. I would look for Janiron Bonner. These are receivers that we've not mentioned when you talk about the two guys on the outside, the transfers, Isaiah Nair and Jamal Banks. So there's more to Nebraska's passing game than just those two big guys who are 6'4", 220 pounds. The tight ends and slot receivers, and they go big on the slot receivers with Bonner and Nelson, the true freshman. They're players who are explosive and can hurt a defense with their ability to run after the catch.
Mhm.
So if that's something where Colorado's weak, I would expect Nebraska to attack it.
Yeah, it was something that Colorado got hurt on a lot last year. One of the main reasons that Colorado State was able to take them to overtime. So we will see if they are able to fix that. When we come back, we are going to give our final predictions ahead of Saturday's matchup. This episode of Locked On Buffs and Locked On Nebraska is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time. My favorite aspect about Game Time, you get to see your seat before you buy. There should be no random pull or weird curve in the stadium in front of you that prevents you from seeing because you get to see every angle, every view over on Game Time. So, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege. It's LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It is game time. Okay, Mitch, it's time for everybody's favorite part of sports analysis. We have to pretend like we know what's going to happen. We have to forecast the future. So let's forecast the future. I like to give a little weather update, line update on everything in between. So everyone knows at this time This is what we knew going into the game. So, according to ESPN, Nebraska has a 60.4% chance of winning. They are a 7-point favorite, which compared to my Thursday episode, Nebraska was a 7.5-point favorite. So the line has moved a little bit. Weather, which obviously weather is always a factor and a weird thing, 84 degrees, sunny. And then, like you mentioned, the capacity, it's expected to be around 90,000. So very full crowd for Colorado, Nebraska. First of all, give me your prediction for the game itself, who you have winning, and then we'll dive into why after.
Sure. Well, I can't deviate from the prediction I made on the Thursday episode of Locked On Nebraska with my co-host Connor. So, and no, I'm not wishy-washy on that. I don't think this is going to be a shootout. I think Colorado is going to want to make this game get into the 30s. And if that's the case, and the Buffs can control the pace and the tempo, then it's probably going to go differently than what I'm predicting. I'm saying 27-17 Nebraska. I think Nebraska will be able to control the tempo with its ground game. It has Rhule, and we've talked all about Rhule and his receivers, both inside and outside. And they'll use those guys, but I think what they're going to want to lean on most are the 4 running backs. Nebraska has 4 number 1 running backs, which sometimes is like having no number 1 running backs if you really don't have someone who's separated from the pack. And coaches in Lincoln want someone to separate from the pack. Maybe that'll happen here in week 2. I think Nebraska controls the game on the ground, limits Colorado possessions, Colorado snaps, holds the Buffs under 20 points, which would be quite an accomplishment. But I think Tony White's defense is up to it and walks away with a 27-17 victory.
See, I'm going a little bit opposite of you. I'm going 35-28 in favor of Colorado. I think Colorado has a chance to make this a shootout. And if it is a shootout, I'm just going with which team's quarterback I trust more at this current moment, which is Shedeur Sanders. Obviously, if this is 5 weeks from now, it could very well be Dylan Rhule. We don't know what he is just yet. But right now, at this moment, I trust Shedeur Sanders more. I think Colorado, like you mentioned, Mitch, they have to get Nebraska playing their game, right? They need to make this sort of a race. And that's not really Nebraska's game, or it hasn't been over the past few years. And so if Colorado could get them there, I think they can win. Like you said, though, if Nebraska is establishing the run and they're keeping Colorado off the field, which we saw North Dakota State do in the first half, I think Colorado had the ball for 8 minutes in the first half against North Dakota State, and the Bison went up with the lead in the first half. Obviously, Nebraska's a better team, so if they could control the clock, establish a run, and just keep Shedeur Sanders off the field, I could see how Nebraska wins this game. So my final question for you is, Nebraska wins this game if, and then I need to fill in the blank for you.
Right. Nebraska wins this game if it keeps Colorado to under, let's say, 65 offensive snaps. I'll even go 60. I'll even say 60 offensive snaps. Huskers held UTEP to 50 offensive snaps, which was an extremely low number last week in the opener, and that's done in part by producing long drives. It's also done by getting 3 and outs on the defensive side. So if you look at that number at halftime and it's under 30, then I think that bodes well for Nebraska in the final outcome of the game. And as I said, 60 at the end of the game. I think that's a bellwether for how this thing's going to go.
Okay, and then Colorado wins this game I'm going to go with if they give Dylan Rhule a welcome to college moment, a welcome to college football moment, which is he's struggling, he's seeing ghosts, he's under pressure, he's uncomfortable in the pocket. Obviously, he's a 5-star quarterback. I don't expect him to be completely rattled. But if Colorado is able to consistently hit him, consistently chase him out of the pocket, I think that's how they win. Because if he's standing back there, able to pick them apart, they will lose this game. And then obviously this will kind of be the birth of, and I've compared this to the birth of Trevor Lawrence, Johnny Manziel, other young quarterbacks in years past, where it's like, this is the game where we remember like, oh, this was his welcome to college football moment. So for Colorado, you need his welcome to college football moment to not be a great one. For Nebraska, they obviously want it to be a great one. And so Colorado needs to get him under pressure. They need to make him uncomfortable. Otherwise, he's a talented quarterback, and we may be witnessing the birth of the next great college football quarterback. Mitch, I appreciate you for hopping on the show and doing this crossover with me. Tell the people where they could find you, what you guys are working on over there on Locked On Nebraska.
Absolutely. Yeah, check us out, Locked On Nebraska on YouTube. Of course, you can find us on all the podcast listening apps. You guys know that if you're listening to the show right now. Locked On NEB on Twitter, Locked On NEB at Gmail on email. Send us a message. We'll be sure Connor and I will when we get back in on Monday to answer those questions. And thanks for having me on, Kevin.
Yeah, no problem. And you guys know where to find me and Locked On Buffs. We're on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I will be doing a reaction from the game right after the game, live from my cousin's wedding in the parking lot, because I will be watching on my phone. People,
Dedication, man.
dedication. You gotta be dedicated. But yeah, it's gonna be a great game. We'll have you covered over here on Locked On Buffs and over at Locked On Nebraska. So make sure to tune in, like, subscribe, and follow. And everyone, have a great college football weekend.